اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ألف لام ميم. أحسب الناس أن يتركوا أن يقولوا آمنا وهم لا يفتنون. ولقد فتنا الذين من قبلهم فليعلمن الله الذين صدقوا وليعلمن الكاذبين. أم حسب الذين يعملون السيئات أن يسبقونا ساء ما يحكمون. من كان يرجو لقاء الله فإن أجل الله لآت. وهو السميع العليم. ومن جاهد فإنما يجاهد لنفسه إن الله لغني عن العالمين. والذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات لنكفرن عنهم سيئاتهم ولنجزينهم أحسن الذي كانوا يعملون. ووصينا الإنسان بوالديه حسنا وإن جاهداك لتشرك بي ما ليس لك به علم فلا تطعهما إلي مرجعكم فأنبئكم بما كنتم تعملون. والذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات لندخلنهم في الصالحين. صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم.
أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من شر الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. سبحان الله والحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين والصلاة والسلام وتحية والإكرام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعلى آله وعترته وأهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين، ولعنة الله على أعدائهم ومنكر فضائلهم وغاصب حقوقهم من الآن إلى قيام يوم الدين. الحمد لله الذي جعلنا من المتمسكين بولاية أمير المؤمنين وأبنائه المعصومين. أما بعد, dear brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. The narrations that have come to us from the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, especially the ones that are akhlaqi or ethical in nature, there are some which are on specific topics. So for example, you might have a narration or a hadith from the Prophet or one of the Imams about the importance of prayer or the importance of fasting or the importance of generosity or these different topics. And then we have what are more general narrations that can be taken as a framework on how we should approach our overall relationship with God and the other servants of God. And so one of those narrations, inshallah, I would like to explore tonight that gives us a very comprehensive framework on how we should behave as Muslims and as followers of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, and hoping that this will be a good reminder for myself and for all the other mu'mineen and mu'minat as well. The narration comes to us from a person by the name of Abu Aswad al-Du'ali, and he says, قال قدمت الربذة. He says, I went to Rabadha and I met فدخلت على أبي ذر جندب ibn Junada. I went to Rabadha and I met Abu Zar, Jundab ibn Junada radiyallahu anh, the famous companion of the Prophet. So his name is Jundab bin Junada, but he is known famously as Abu Dhar. And he says that فَحَدَثَنِي Abu Dhar. Then Abu Dhar gave me a narration. Now, before we continue, there's a lot of interesting points in this narration, such as who is Abu Asad al-Du'ali and how he was the founder of Arabic grammar in a sense. And the question of what is Rabadha and why exactly was Abu Dhar in Rabadha in the last few days of his life. It's especially pertinent as in certain parts of the Muslim world, there are all these discussions about honor and respect of the companions of the Prophet. One of these companions of the Prophet was Abu Dhar. And it's strange that this topic of how Abu Dhar, as one of the greatest companions of the Prophet, how he was treated by the Muslims of the time doesn't really get discussed. And I'm just leaving that as an open topic for us to further explore and understand why Abu Dhar was in Rabadha in the last few days of his life and why he died alone, even though he was one of the most illustrious and respected companions of the Prophet. But regardless, the narration is from Abu Aswad al-Du'ali, and he says that I went to Rabadha to meet Abu Dhar while he was in Rabadha, and Abu Dhar at that moment gave me a narration from the Prophet. And now Abu Dhar is talking, and Abu Dhar is saying, دخلت ذات يوم في صدر نهاره على رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. Abu Dhar is now recalling, and he's saying that one day in the early hours of the morning, I went to visit the Prophet في مسجده, in his masjid. فلم أرى في المسجد أحدا من الناس إلا رسول الله وعلي عليه السلام إلى جانبه. He says, I went to the masjid and there was no one in there besides the Prophet, and Ali alayhi salam was sitting on his ila janibihi jalisun, sitting on his side. فَأَغْتَمْتُ خَلْوَةَ الْمَسْجِدِ. He says, I took this as an opportunity that there's no one else here, we're the only ones in the masjid. فَقُلْتُ, I said to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wasallam, Ya Rasulullah, بِأَبِي أَنْتَ وَأُمِّي أَوْصَنِي بِوَصِيَّةٍ يَنْفَعُنِي بِهَا يَنْفَعُنِي اللَّهُ بِهَا. He says, I took this as an opportunity and I said to the Prophet that, O Rasulullah, give me some wasiyat, give me some advice with which I can benefit with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he continues and says that the Prophet gave him many different pieces of advice, and it's a very long tradition. So one of those pieces of advice that the Prophet gave to Abu Dharr, rahmatullah alayhi, or radiyallahu anh, is inshallah something that I'm hoping we can discuss today in the short amount of time that we have. So among the advice, among the wasiyat that the Prophet is giving to Abu Dharr is the following. One more point to mention before we mention the wasiyat is that there's a difference when you ask the Prophet what is wajib and what's haram for me to do as a Muslim, and the Prophet is talking to an ordinary person, versus in this situation you have someone like Abu Dharr who is at the highest levels of iman. We have other narrations, for example, which tell us that Salman was at the 10th level of iman, at the highest level of faith, of certainty, and Abu Dharr was at the 9th level. So this is some very special advice that the Prophet is giving to a very special person. And so we should look at it from that context, that this is not just the Prophet talking to an ordinary person, this is the Prophet talking to the khawas, to someone who was among the very special and close companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so we should take it with that in mind, that inshallah we can also act according to this narration, and perhaps that will also elevate us to be among those khawas, among those special companions of and close ones of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So coming to the narration, the Prophet says to Abu Dharr, Ya Abu Dharr, man lam ya'ti yawm al-qiyamah bithalathin faqad khasar. The Prophet says, O Abu Dharr, whoever does not come on the day of judgment with possessing 3 things, then that person will be in a state of loss. In other words, in order to be successful on the day of judgment, one must have these 3 characteristics or qualities. قُلْتُ وَمَا الثَّلَاثِ فِدَاكَ أَبِي وَأُمِّي. Abu Dharr says, O Prophet, may I be sacrificed, may my mother and father be sacrificed for you. What are those 3 qualities? And the Prophet says, قَالَ وَرَعٌ يَحْجُزُهُ عَمَّا حَرَّمَ اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ عَلَيْهِ. The Prophet says the first quality that you must have in order to not be a loser on the day of judgment is that you must have wara, which prevents you from doing that which Allah has made prohibited. The second quality that the Prophet mentions is وَحِلْمٌ يَرُدُّ بِهِ جُهْلَ السُّفَهَاءِ. He says the second quality that you should have is that you must have hilm, or forbearance, and we'll talk about all of these 3 briefly. You must have hilm that allows you to deal with those who are ignorant and unworthy of you. And then the third quality that the Prophet mentions, وَخُلْقٌ يُضَارِ بِهِ النَّاسِ, that you must have good manners and akhlaq with how you react with different people. And then we have a similar version of this narration where the Prophet is speaking to Imam Ali alayhi salam in a different situation. And the Prophet says, قَالَ رَسُولُ اللَّهِ يَا عَلِي ثَلَاثٌ مَنْ لَمْ يَتُمَّ عَمَلُهُ. O Ali, whoever does not have the following 3 qualities, their amal, their actions, their good deeds are not really going to be complete. And in a similar narration, very similar words, the Prophet says to Imam Ali, again, same 3 things. وَرَعٌ يَحْجُزُهُ عَنْ مَعَاسِيَ اللَّهُ عَزَّ وَجَلَّ. The first thing is, again, you should have wara, which keeps you away from disobedience of Allah. Second, وَخُلْقٌ يُضَارِ بِهِ النَّاسِ, you must have khulq or akhlaq or good manners on how you deal with the people. وَحِلْمٌ يَرُدُّ بِهِ جَهْلَ الْجَاهِلِ, and you must have hilm and forbearance regarding those who are ignorant, who are jahil. So the hadith is giving us a very good framework in three different areas. It's talking to us about what kind of relationship we should have with Allah. It's talking about what kind of relationship we should have with people who are good to us. And it's talking about what kind of relationship we should have with people who are not good to us. So there's three aspects of relationships that this narration is helping us understand. The first quality that the narration is talking about is the relationship with Allah. What kind of relationship should we have with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? And there the narration says that the essential quality is to have wara. Wara, because wara prevents you from doing that which Allah has prohibited. There's a difference between taqwa and wara. Taqwa means to not do those things which Allah has prohibited, to not commit sins. Wara is a state of mind which is saying that I maintain myself in such a way that prevents me from getting to that point of disobeying Allah. So in other words, wara is a higher level than just having taqwa. Taqwa is something we define as basically not committing sins. And so one of the scholars, he actually uses a very beautiful analogy to describe the concept of wara, especially with the current pandemic situation. It might sound a little cheesy, but it made a lot of sense. And I think it's good to think of it this way because it helps you understand things very well. He says, look, when, under normal circumstances, before COVID-19 started, general good practice for everyone was supposed to be you wash your hands with soap. If you touch something dirty, you use hand sanitizer. You stay away from anything that someone has coughed on or sneezed on, or if someone coughs at you or sneezes at you, you always stay away from that person or maintain a distance. When you're coughing or sneezing, that you sneeze in your elbow, or you don't, or you cough in your elbow, or you cough inside your shirt. That was just general basic practice that everyone should have been doing all along. And he says that this is kind of like taqwa. This is basic practice, basic hygiene practices that we should have been following all along before the pandemic even started. And that's one way to think about taqwa. Taqwa is just generally being careful and staying away from those things which are harmful, not germs in a physical sense, but taqwa where things are harmful in a spiritual sense. And then he says, now wara is basically what we're all doing now when we're living under this pandemic, meaning we're wearing masks all the time. We're constantly carrying hand sanitizer all the time. Anytime we see someone, even a small cough or a small sneeze, it's like people run away from that person. Any little thing that might happen, we wash our hands for 20, 30 seconds. Sometimes we use all this extra hand sanitizer. Any surface that gets dirty, immediately we bring out the wipes. We saw all the craziness that happened at the grocery stores with the wipes selling out and hand sanitizer selling out. Why? Because people are in this hyper-vigilant state of mind. They're paying attention to every little thing. No chances. I'm not going to take any risks with my health whatsoever. If I have to wash my hand 7 times, it's better to wash my hands 7 times than to possibly trying to get this virus. This is basically wara. The scholar who I was talking about this was saying that this is essentially the wara state of mind, is to have that hyper-vigilant state of mind when it comes to anything that might potentially lead me toward disobedience of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That very, very strict attention to detail. And of course, when we think about in these pandemic circumstances, that level of hypervigilance, it's very difficult. It's hard to sustain that on a long-term basis. And so we try as much as we can. A lot of these things, like if someone sneezes somewhere and you touch it, you should immediately wash your hands. A lot of that we should have been doing all along. It's just that COVID forced us to do these things. But the point being here is that as much as we can reach that higher level of wara, that higher level of hypervigilance, where I'm careful about every little thing, we should try to get to that level of wara as much as we can. But if I can't get to that higher level, if I can't get to that super vigilant state of mind, then the very minimum is taqwa. Then the very minimum is to make sure that I'm not committing sins. And I'm at least doing the things which are mandatory, which are wajib and farz on me as a Muslim. So wara is a higher level that the Prophet is advising to Abu Dhar. And so that should be the target and goal, to be at that hypervigilant state of God consciousness, so that any little thing that might potentially take me away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that might potentially lead to a sin, not committing a sin, which might lead to a sin, I stay away from that. That's wara. And that should be the goal. But if we cannot reach that level, then at the very least, the goal should be to be at the level of taqwa, inshallah. The next quality that the Prophet is advising to Abu Dhar is he's saying that in regard to the relationship with people who are good to us. So the first quality was our relationship with Allah. Now coming down to creation, he's talking about what kind of quality we should have in regard to those who are good to us. Family members, our children, our friends, our associates, our co-workers, just people generally who treat us well. And that quality that the Prophet mentioned is to have khulq. And this is the quality that all the prophets of God had, and this is the main mission of our holy Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Is he famously says in Shia and Sunni narrations, it's mentioned, "Innama bu'ithtu li'utammima makarim al-akhlaq." He says, I was not sent, I was not appointed for any other reason except to perfect the akhlaq of people. So it's very important in this regard that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam is telling us that this quality is essential. Having good khulq, good manners, and good akhlaq is essential on how we interact with others, especially those who are good to us and those who are close to us. The Prophet himself is described in these words. Imam Ali alayhi salam, in a narration, says that the Prophet was always cheerful and smiling with those whom he was in the company with. I'm reading the exact words, this is not me paraphrasing or anything. This is exactly the translation of the narration from Amir al-Mu'mineen. He says the Prophet was always cheerful and smiling with those whom he was in the company with, and was always found to be gentle and soft-spoken. He was never seen to be angry, hard-hearted, rude, foul-speaking, picking faults of others, or excessively praising anyone. Not a single person was ever made to feel hopeless by him, and anyone who entered his house did not leave disparaged, did not leave in a state of hopelessness. There are three things that he kept away from himself. There are three things that the Prophet never did: arguing with others, meaning getting into unnecessary arguments, speaking too much, and entering and interfering in things which were none of his business. And he says there are two things about the Prophet which he kept away from in regards to other people. He says he never ridiculed people, and he never went out to seek out their mistakes and slips and to find other people's faults. It says that, however, it is also seen that while in his presence, those around him did not indulge in arguments or wrangling. Anytime a stranger or some strange person who didn't know the Prophet would begin to speak with anger and ask for something, the Prophet would bear his attitude with patience, and he would tell his companions, anytime you see a person who has some need, make sure you fulfill this person's need. Meaning, instead of saying be quiet or stop being rude, he would just say this guy probably has something he needs, so help him out and take care of his needs so that he doesn't have to act in this manner. It says he never, and the final thing that he says, he never cut anyone's speech short and waited for the person to finish what he wanted to say. Meaning he would never interrupt others, and he would always wait for them to finish whatever that they had to say before he himself would start to talk. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And the last quality that the Prophet mentions, and this is something that we'll conclude with, is the relationship with people who are not good to us, who we do not have a good relationship with, or who are difficult, who are either acting in an ignorant manner, who are acting in a difficult manner, who are acting in a rude manner with us. In case of these people, the Prophet says that the quality that we should have for them is hilm, is to have forbearance. What is forbearance? What is a person who has hilm? The narration mentions this is a person who, even though he is able to do something, does not go forth to perform it and does not make haste in regard to punishing a guilty person for his crime. In other words, someone has done something bad to me. I have the ability to take revenge. I have the ability to teach this person a lesson. I have the ability to do something back to them. Hilm is that you don't do that. Even if I have the ability, he cursed me, let me give him some more foul language in return. He cut me off on the highway, watch me now, I'm going to go in front of him and brake really hard. Right? I have the ability to do that. But a halim person is someone who does not take that action, even when they have the ability to do it, and even when the other person has clearly done something wrong. And then the narration continues, he's a person who has a spiritually large soul. And this last part is so crucial. And this person is in complete control over his or her emotions. The idea of emotional intelligence, which is something that now you see Western psychology and in business practices and other places, they're talking about how EQ, having emotional quotient, having emotional stability, and having emotional intelligence is so much more important than IQ, which is the intelligence quotient, or sort of a book smart kind of a person. The Prophet was talking about this 1400 years ago, that this is what it takes to be a successful person on the Day of Judgment, is to have control over our emotions, is that we don't let our emotions control us. We don't get overcome with negative emotions when things don't go the way that we expect. And this is where the narration tells us, Al-hilmu sirajullahi yastadi'u bihi sahibahu ila jiwari. That having hilm is a lantern through which the person who has hilm is able to illuminate and stay out of darkness and others around him or her. وَلَا يَكُونُ حَلِيمًا, and one cannot become halim إِلَّا الْمُؤَيَّدُ بِأَنْوَارِ الْمَعْرِفَةِ وَالتَّوْحِيدِ. And you cannot become a halim person unless one has been illuminated by understanding of God and by understanding of the concept of Tawheed. And we see this in the life of the Ma'asumeen more than anything else. We see this in the life of our fourth Imam alayhi salam, when that same Marwan bin Hakam, Allahumma la'an ala Abi Sufyan wa ala Ziyad wa ala Marwan, that same Marwan that we sent damnation upon in Ziyad Ashura, that same Marwan who's an avowed enemy of the Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam. But when political circumstances changed, and that same Marwan was now going door to door in Medina, seeking refuge for himself and his family, and no one wanted to let him in because they knew he's a wanted man by the government now. Yet when he comes to the door of Sayyidul Sajideen, Zainul Abidin alayhi salam, the Imam opens the door and he says, your family, they're safe here. They can stay here for as long as it's necessary for them until this political turmoil and unrest is over. And when this person is shocked and he says that you know who I am, you know how I have behaved with your father and with your grandfather before them. And the Imam says, yes, but that was your akhlaq and this is our akhlaq. That is the kind of person that you are, but this is the kind of people that we, the family of the Prophet, are. And so inshallah we can implement these three qualities in our lives that the Prophet is giving as advice to his respected companion Abu Dhar. The Prophet is saying in regard to Allah, we must have wara and obedience and stay away from the things which are haram. In regard to those who are our friends, we are good-natured. And in regard to those who are evil to us, we are forbearing and forgiving with them. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alayki ya bint Rasulillah. Assalamu alayki ya bint Amir al-Mu'mineen. Assalamu alayki ya bint Hossein al-Shaheed. Wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. السلام عليك أيتها الصغيرة الشهيدة. السلام عليك أيتها المقهورة المظلومة. السلام عليك أيتها الفاضلة الرشيدة. السلام عليك أيتها الجليلة الجميلة. السلام عليك أيتها البعيدة عن الأوطان. السلام عليك أيتها الأسيرة في البلدان. السلام عليك يا مولاتي وابنة مولاي والسيدتي وابنة سيدي ورحمة الله وبركاته. The little daughter of Imam Hussein alayhi salam was so used to sleeping on the chest of her father every night that after the incident of Ashura, when the tents are burned and looted, she couldn't sleep on the ground and she goes looking for the body of her father. She narrates to us that when I reached the body of my father, I heard a voice that said, Shi'ati mahma im sharibtum azbin ma'in fadhkuruni, aw sami'atum bi shahidin aw gharibin fandubuni. O my Shias, when you drink some cold water, then remember me. And when you hear about a shaheed or a lonely person, then shed some tears for me as well. The women of Ahlul Bayt were taken as prisoners to Kufa and Sham, and finally they are put in the prison of Sham. The little daughter of Imam Hussein used to cry so much that the narration says that the people of Sham began to call her Ruqayya, meaning the girl who always used to cry. The prison of Sham was under the open sky. There was no roof in that prison. The Maqatil say that in the evenings, this little girl would look up and she would see birds flying and she would say to Imam Sajjad, oh my dear brother, tell me where are these birds going? Imam Sajjad would say, it is evening now, so the birds are going back to their homes. And Bibi Ruqayya would say, my brother, when will that day come when I will go back home too? And imagine how the heart of Imam Sajjad would break every time. If anyone else were to ask this question, if Bibi Zainab were to say, oh Sajjad, when are we going back home? If Bibi Rubab were to say, oh Sajjad, when are we going to go back home? The Imam could have said, we will go back home soon, inshallah. But how is he supposed to respond to this girl? How is he supposed to tell his little sister that, oh my sister, all of us will go back home to Medina. Zainab will go back to Medina, Rabab will go back to Medina. We will all go back home and sleep on our beds, but you will not be able to go back in Medina. You will pass away in this prison and you will sleep on the dirt floor of your grave inside this prison forever. Every night she cries for her father. And at night when she finally falls asleep, one night she goes to sleep and she wakes up a little while later and she keeps saying, where is my father? Where is my father? And at that moment, she stands up and starts walking toward the door of the prison and she says, I can smell the fragrance of my father coming toward me. I think my father is finally coming to take me. And just then the door opens and the servants of Yazid open the door. They bring a tray covered with a cloth. As the cloth is removed, the ladies see the severed head of Imam al-Hussein on the tray. They all stand up and they say, Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. Assalamu alayka ya ibn Rasulillah. What happens next, we all know. But imagine the heart of Imam Sajjad. Imagine the heart of Bibi Zainab when she goes back to Karbala on Arba'in. When she arrives at the grave of Imam Hussein, what must she have said? She must have said, oh my brother, forgive me, because we left your amanat in Sham. We took Ruqayya with us, but we did not bring Ruqayya back with us. We have left Ruqayya back in the prison of Sham. ألا ولعنة الله على القوم الظالمين وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. يا حسين.
या हुसैन या रब कोई मासूमा जिंदा में न तन्हा हो या रब कोई मासूमा जिंदा में न तन्हा हो या रब कोई मासूमा जिंदा में न तन्हा हो या रब कोई मासूमा जिंदा में न तन्हा हो पाबंद ना हो आहे हाय पाबंद ना हो आहे रोने पे न पहरा हो या रब कोई मासूमा जिंदा में न तन्हा हो थी जिसको नींद आती शबीर के सीने पर थी जिसको नींद आती शबीर के सीने पर जिंदा दर जिंदा हाय जिंदा दर जिंदा उसके लिए क़ज़ा हो या रब कोई मासूमा जिंदा में न तन्हा हो जिंदानों से आती थी आवाज से सकने की जिंदानों से आती थी आवाज से सकने की जैसे कि सकीना को हाय जैसे कि सकीना को हर जिंदान रो रहा हो या रब को मासूमा जिंदा में न तन्हा हो टकराए न वो क्यों कर जिंदा की दीवारों से टकराए न वो क्यों कर जिंदा की दीवारों से भाई से और फूफी से हाय भाई से और फूफी से जिसको जुदा किया हो या रब कोई मासूमा जिंदा में न तन्हा हो या रब कोई मासूमा जिंदा में न तन्हा हो थी जिसको नींद आती शबीर के सीने पर थी जिसको नींद आती शबीर के सीने पर जिंदा दर जिंदा हाय जिंदा दर जिंदा उसके लिए क़ज़ा हो या रब कोई मासूमा जिंदा में न तन्हा हो या रब कोई मासूमा जिंदा में न तन्हा हो या हुसैन
اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. اللهم إني أسألك برحمتك التي وسعت كل شيء وبقوتك التي قهرت بها كل شيء وخضع لها كل شيء وذل لها كل شيء وبجبروتك التي غلبت بها كل شيء وبعزتك التي لا يقوم لها شيء وبعظمتك التي ملأت كل شيء وبسلطانك الذي على كل شيء وبوجهك الباقي بعد فناء كل شيء وبأسمائك التي ملأت أركان كل شيء وبعلمك الذي أحاط بكل شيء وبنور وجهك الذي أضاء له كل شيء يا نور يا قدوس يا أول الأولين ويا آخر الآخرين. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تهتك العصام. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل النقام. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل النقام. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تغير النعم. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تحبس الدعاء. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تقطع الرجاء. اللهم اغفر لي الذنوب التي تنزل البلاء. اللهم اغفر لي كل ذنب أذنبته وكل خطيئة أخطأتها. اللهم إني أتقرب إليك بذكرك وأستشفع بك إلى نفسك وأسألك بجودك أن تدنيني من قربك وأن توزعني شكرك وأن تلهمني ذكرك. اللهم إني أسألك سؤال خاضع متذلل خاشع أن تصامحني وترحمني وتجعلني بقسمك راضيا قانعا وفي جميع الأحوال متواضعا. اللهم وأسألك سؤال من اشتدت فاقته وأنزل بك عند الشدائد حاجته وعظم فيما عندك رغبته. اللهم عظم سلطانك وعلى مكانك فخفي مكرك وظهر أمرك وغلب قهرك وجرت قدرتك ولا يمكن الفرار من حكومتك. اللهم لا أجد لذنوبي غافرا ولا لقبائحي ساترا ولا لشيء من عملي القبيح بالحسن مبدلا غيرك. لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك وبحمدك ظلمت نفسي وتجرأت بجهلي وسكنت إلى قديم ذكرك لي ومنك علي. اللهم مولاي كم من قبيح سترته وكم من فاضح من البلاء أقلته وكم من عثار وقيته وكم من مكروه دفعته وكم من ثناء جميل لست أهلا له نشرته. اللهم عظم بلائي وأفرت بي سوء حالي وقصرت بي أعمالي وقعدت بي أغلالي وحبسني عن نفعي بعد أملي وخدعتني الدنيا بغرورها ونفسي بجنايتها ومثالي. يا سيدي فأسألك بعزتك ألا يحجب عنك دعائي سوء عملي وفعالي ولا تفضحني بخفي ما اطلعت عليه من سري ولا تعاجلني بالعقوبة على ما عملته في خلواتي. من سوء فعلي وإساءتي ودوام تفريطي وجهالتي وكثرة شهواتي وغفلتي. وكن اللهم بعزتك لي في كل الأحوال رؤوفا وعلي في جميع الأمور عطوفا. إلهي وربي من لي غيرك أسأله كشف ضري والنظر في أمري. إلهي ومولاي أجريت علي حكما اتبعت فيه هوى نفسي ولم أحترس فيه من تزيين عدوي فغرني بما أهوى وأسعده على ذلك القضاء. فتجاوزت بما جرى علي من ذلك بعد حدودك وخالفت بعد أوامرك. فلك الحمد علي في جميع ذلك ولا حجة لي فيما جرى علي فيه قضاؤك وألزمني حكمك وبلاؤك. وقد أتيتك يا إلهي بعد تقصيري وإسرافي على نفسي معتذرا نادما منكسرا مستقيلا مستغفرا منيبا مقرا مذعنا معترفا. لا أجد مفرا مما كان مني ولا مفزعا أتوجه إليه في أمري غير قبولك عذري وإدخالك إياي في سعة رحمتك. اللهم فاقبل عذري وارحم شدة ضري وفكني من شد وثاقي. يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني. يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني. يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني.
يا رب ارحم ضعف بدني ورقة جلدي ودقة عظمي، يا من بدأ خلقي وذكري وتربيتي وبري وتغذيتي. أبني لابتداء كرمك وسالف برك بي. يا إلهي وسيدي وربي، أتراك معذبي بنارك بعد توحيدك وبعد من طوى عليه قلبي من معرفتك ولهج به لساني من ذكرك واعتقده ضميري من حبك وبعد صدق اعترافي ودعائي خاضعا لربوبيتك. هيهات أنت أكرم من أن تضيع من ربيت أو تبعد من أدنيت أو تشرد من آويت أو تسلم إلى البلاء من كفيته ورحمته. وليت شعري يا سيدي وإلهي ومولاي أتسلط النار على وجوه خرت لعظمتك ساجدة وعلى ألسن نطقت بتوحيدك صادقة وبشكرك مادحة وعلى قلوب اعترفت بإلهيتك محققة وعلى ذمار حوت من العلم بك حتى صارت خاشعة وعلى جوارح سعت إلى أوطان تعبدك طاعة وشارت باستغفارك مذعنة. ما هكذا الظن بك ولا أخبرنا بفضلك عنك يا كريم يا رب. وأنت تعلم ضعفي قليلا من بلاء الدنيا وغوباتها وما يجري فيها من المكاره على أهلها. ألا أن ذلك بلاء ومكروه قليل مكثه يسير بقاؤه قصير مدته. فكيف احتمالي لبلاء الآخرة وجليل وقوع المكاره فيها وهو بلاء تطول مدته يدوم مقامه ولا يخفف عن أهله لأنه لا يكون إلا عن غضبك وانتقامك وسخطك وهذا ما لا تقوم له السماوات والأرض. يا سيدي فكيف آلي وأنا عبدك ضعيف ذليل الحقير المسكين المستكين. يا إلهي وربي وسيدي ومولاي، لي الأمور إليك أشكو، ولما منها أذج وأبكي. لأليم العذاب وشدته، حمل طول البلاء ومدته. فلئن سيرتني للعقوبات مع أعدائك، وجمعت بيني وبين أهل بلائك، وفرقت بيني وبين أحبائك وأوليائك، فهبني يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي يا ربي. صبرت على عذابك، فكيف أصبر على فراقك؟ وهبني صبرت على حر نارك، فكيف أصبر عن النظر إلى كرامتك؟ أم كيف أسكن في النار ورجائي عفوك؟ فبذتك يا سيدي ومولاي أقسم صادقا، لأن تركتني ناثقا لذجن إليك بين أهلاذجي العاملين، ولأصرخن إليك صراخ المستصرخين، ولأبكين إليك بكاء الفاقدين، ولأنادينك أين كنت يا ولي المؤمنين، يا غاية أعمال العارفين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا غياث المستغيثين، يا غياث المستغيثين.
يا غياث المستغيثين، يا حبيب قلوب الصادقين، ويا إله العالمين، أفتراك سبحانك يا إلهي وبحمدك تسمع فيها صوت عبد مسلم سجن فيها بمخالفته، وذاك طعام عذابها بمعصيته، وحبس بين أطباقها بجرمه وجريرته، وهو يذج إليك ذجيج مؤمل لرحمتك، ويناديك بلسان أهل توحيدك، ويتوسل إليك بربوبيتك. يا مولاي، فكيف يبقى في العذاب وهو يرجو ما سلف من حلمك؟ أم كيف تؤلمه النار وهو يعمل فضلك ورحمتك؟ أم كيف يهرقه لهيبها وأنت تسمع صوتا وترى مكانا؟ أم كيف يشتمل عليه زفيرها وأنت تعلم ضعفا؟ أم كيف يتقلقل بين أطباقها وأنت تعلم صدقا؟ أم كيف تزجره زبانيتها وهو يناديك يا رب؟ أم كيف يرجو فضلك في إتقي منها فتتركه فيها؟ هيهات ما ذلك الظن بك، ولا المعروف من فضلك، ولا مشبه لما عاملت به الموحدين من برك وإحسانك. فباليقين أخطأ لولا ما حكمت به من تعذيب جاهدك وقضيت به من إخلاد معاندك، لجعلت النار كلها بردا وسلاما، وما كان لأحد فيها مقرا ولا مقاما، لكنك تقدست أسماؤك أقسمت أن تملاها من الكافرين من الجنة والناس أجمعين، وأن تخلد فيها المعاندين، وأن تجل ثناؤك. قلت مبتدئا وتدولت بالإنعام متكرما، أفمن كان مؤمنا كمن كان فاسقا لا يستوون. إلهي وسيدي، فأسألك بالقدرة التي قدرتها وبالقضية التي حكمتها وحكمتها وغلبت من عليه أجريتها، أن تهب لي في هذه الليلة وفي هذه الساعة كل جرم أجرمته، وكل ذنب أذنبته، وكل قبيح أسررت، وكل جهل عملت، كتمت أو أعلنت، أخفيت أو أظهرت، وكل سيئة أمرت بإثباتها الكرام الكاتبين الذين وكلتهم بحفظ ما يكون مني، وجعلتهم شهودا علي مع جواري، وكنت أنت الرقيب علي من ورائهم والشاهد لما خفي عنهم، وبرحمتك أخفيت وبفضلك سترت، وأن توفر حظي من كل خير أنزلت أو إحسان فضلت أو بر نشرت أو رزق بسطت أو ذنب تغفره أو خطأ تستره يا ربي يا ربي يا رب يا إلهي وسيدي ومولاي ومالك رقي يا من بيده ناصيتي يا علما بضري ومسكنتي يا خبيرا بفقري وفاقتي يا ربي يا ربي يا رب أسألك بحقك وقدسك وعظم صفاتك وأسمائك أن تجعل أوقاتي في الليل والنهار بذكرك مأمورة وبخدمتك موصولة وأعمالي عندك مقبولة حتى تكون أعمالي وأورادي كلها وردا واحدا وهالي في خدمتك سرمدا يا سيدي يا من عليه معولي يا من إليه شكوت أهوالي يا ربي يا ربي يا رب قوي على خدمتك جواره واشدد على العزيمة جوانه وهب لي الجد في خشيتك والدوام في الاتصال بخدمتك حتى أسرع إليك في ميادين السابقين وأسرع إليك في المبادرين واشتاق إلى قربك في المشتاقين وأذنو منك ذنو المخلصين وأخافك مخافة الموقنين واجتمع في جوارك مع المؤمنين اللهم ومن أرادني بسوء فارد ومن كادني فكد واجعلني من أحسن عبيدك نصيبا عندك وأقربهم منزلة منك وأخصهم زلفة لديك فإنه لا ينال ذلك إلا بفضلك وجد إليه بجودك واعطف علي بمجدك واحفظني برحمتك واجعل لساني بذكرك لهجا قلبي بحبك متيما ومن علي بحسن إجابتك وأقلني أثرتي واغفر زلتي فإنك قضيت على عبادك بعبادتك وأمرتهم بدعائك وضمنت لهم الإجابة فإليك يا ربي نصبت وجهي وإليك يا ربي مددت يدي فبعزتك استجب لي دعائي وبلغني مناي ولا تقطع من فضلك رجائي واكفني شر الجن والإنس من أعدائي يا سريع الرضا اغفر لمن لا يملك إلا الدعاء فإنك فعال لما تشاء يا من اسمه دواء وذكره شفاء وطاعته غنى ارحم من راس ماله الرجاء وسلاحه البكاء يا سابغ النعم يا دافع النقم يا نور المستوحشين في الظلام يا عالما لا يعلم صل على محمد وآل محمد وافعل بما أنت أحلو وصلى الله على رسوله والأئمة الميامين من آله وسلم تسليما كثيرا كثيرا اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد
صلى الله عليك يا أبا عبد الله صلى الله عليك يا أبا عبد الله صلى الله عليك يا أبا عبد الله. Let us recite 5 times Amman Yujib together. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه يكشف 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 السوء ويكشف الهم ويكشف الضر. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.